Thank you so much for coming out to the second part of the war in 1863. I'm John Foster. I know practically every one of you. But the time I don't say who I am, so this happened one time a couple of years ago. I got to the end of a talk and a guy came up to me and was like, "Who are you?" So I'm contractually obligated to tell everybody, my name's John Foster. I'm a reference librarian here at the Mentor Public Library. I have a degree, I have a doctorate in European history, I have a doctorate in German history, which doesn't really fit me out, you would think, maybe necessarily talk about this, but I like reading books, and there you go. And with me is Todd Arrington, the head ranger over at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, with whom we have a long and really awesome relationship. So just to sort of teaser you, Todd and I were sort of talking about something we might do next year, and we're thinking about doing like our favorite presidents.
That won't be controversial at all.
Right, yeah, I know. I think we should probably call it like our favorite presidents before 1962. but we'll see how that shakes out. I still got to pitch it to my boss. And it's not like she's going to say no, but I have to come up with like a coherent idea of what it's going to be. So last time covered a huge amount of ground. There was a point at which, preparing this, I'm like, oh my God, most of the really interesting things that happened in the Civil War in 1863 happened prior to July 4th. Which is not in fact true. And but the Civil War is just full of endless sort of interesting stories. So there's a point, Todd is going to talk a bit about John Morgan's cavalry raid. And but I wanted to mention this about it. When Morgan was heading north through Kentucky, he was crossing the Green River and he ran into about 4 regiments of Michigan troops who had sort of fortified a point. And so Morgan sent a guy up and said, well, why don't you surrender? And this was the 4th of July, and the commander said, well, normally I'd probably do it, but given what day it is, I can't surrender without a brush. So they had a little fight, and then Morgan realized the real truth of the matter, which is there was no point in hanging around. It didn't matter that these guys were forded up on the Green River, so he headed north, and they, I think, went back to tipping the odd cup in celebration of the 4th of July. Probably, but at that point, they didn't know what else had happened on the 4th of July, given the way that news moved across the country. But this is the sort of the really interesting thing to me about talking about the Civil War is that they're very similar to us, but because we're all Americans, right? But they're also they're kind of different. And there's that sort of moment I talked about last time where Jeb Stuart was laying siege to Carlisle Barracks, and he offered to the Union commander there to meet with him to talk about surrender, and the Union commander said to the guy he'd sent in, well, why don't you tell your commander that I'd sooner meet him in a much warmer place, by which he meant in hell. So, but this is, I love, you cannot help but love these guys. They're fascinating and they're courageous, and we're going to talk about a lot of interesting things, and some of the hottest fighting of the entire war happens in the second half of 1863, which is often, forgotten. Just in between the Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg, which was Gettysburg particularly had some pretty hot action. But there's also that series of incredibly violent conflicts that go on in sort of central Virginia around Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse. These are all like, when you know what happened there, it kind of makes the hair rise on the back of your neck, because they're just, points at which there was real slaughter. But anyway, so last time I nattered on for quite some time and then left it to Todd. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to leave it to Todd Arrington to start our talk. Take it away, Ranger Todd.
All right, thank you. And, pursuant to what you were saying there, John, about, how fascinating all these guys are and how they're like us and yet different from us at the same time, it makes me think of one of my favorite quotes, and I cannot remember who said it. Maybe you know. And of course, as historians, this is particularly relevant to us, and the quote is, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." So they talk differently, they act differently, and yet we kind of can see ourselves. I think it's an apropos quote to start the evening. So yes, as you see on the screen there, I come from the other side of what John was talking about earlier about forgetting to say who he is. I come from the side of whenever you get out in front of a group and you're about to start a ranger program, you always have to introduce yourself. And then, of course, I get to wear my name on my shirt every day, so it's always pretty easy. And then I go to meetings and they want to hand me one of those like paper, hello, my name is, and I'm like, nah, I don't need that. I'm ready for you. But anyway, I put it on the screen for you anyway. So I'm Todd Arrington. I'm the site manager down at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, and my background is all in American history. So John mentioned that he comes from the European history background. My background is all in American history. I've been working for the National Park Service for going on 25 years now. I've worked in 7 different parks, and almost all of them, actually all of them had a very strong component to American history. 6 of them were strictly history parks, and one where I just went on a temporary assignment was more of a natural park. But of course, being a historian, I found something there that I could sink my teeth into as well. But anyway, so I'm going to be talking about the second half of 1863, and I'm going to be talking about the Eastern Theater this time. So we kind of, we're switching. So last month we did the first half of the year. John did the East and I did the West. This time we're flipping. So I'm going to do the East and he's going to do the West. And of course he gets all the fun, cool battles to talk about this time. But as it turns out, I'm actually much more interested in the politics of the era than the actual military conflicts. So a lot of what I get to talk about tonight is the stuff that I find really interesting anyway, because so much of what happens in the East, yes, there certainly is fighting. There certainly are battles in the East in the second half of 1863. But a lot of what's going on in the Eastern Theater after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, really is as much political as it is military. And then when you get to the second half of 1863, a lot of the really brutal battles that are critically important to how the war shakes out happen in the Western Theater, and so John will get to talk about those tonight. But just to remind you where we left off last month when we were here, we finished with going right into the very beginning of July of 1863. So we have two successive days with major Union victories. Of course, July 3rd, 1863 is the Union victory at Gettysburg. And then the very next day, July 4th, 1863, is the capture or the surrender, if you will, of Vicksburg in the Western Theater, Vicksburg being one of the Confederacy's last real outposts on the Mississippi River. So there's this view of Civil War history that, the first couple years of the war were really bad for the Union. And that is somewhat true in the Eastern Theater. The Union this is where, Lincoln was struggling to find a general that he liked and that would go after the Confederate armies. They were all obsessed with capturing Richmond. And of course, Lincoln is saying, who cares if we capture Richmond if they've still got 200,000 troops in the field? We haven't won anything. We still have to destroy the armies. But it was in the Western Theater, which I'm not going to talk about because that's John's tonight, but it was in the Western Theater where the Union armies did have success early in the war. That's where those guys with that mentality more similar to Lincoln's came from. Guys like Ulysses S. Grant, the one who you see there, holding his hat up in the second photo at Vicksburg, captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, won the battle at Shiloh. It was the Western Theater where these guys like Grant and Sherman, and if dare I say James A. Garfield, really kind of were looking at the war very differently than the generals in the East, who just always seemed to be obsessed with capturing Richmond. That, of course, starts to turn a little bit here in the middle of 1863 when we get the Union victory at Gettysburg. When I was growing up in Gettysburg, believe it or not, yes, that's where I grew up, and that's how I got interested in working for the Park Service and interested in history. I remember going through, 11th grade American history like everybody else, and being told, Gettysburg is the turning point of the war. It's the high tide of the Confederacy. And, maybe that's true to some degree, but, boy, we sure didn't hear much about Vicksburg growing up in Gettysburg, I can assure you. And I'm sure that kids growing up in Vicksburg, Mississippi probably don't hear that much about Gettysburg either. That's just a sideshow compared to what's happening in Vicksburg. But at any rate, this sets the stage for where we're going to go for the rest of 1863. These two major Union victories, one day right after the other. Gettysburg in the East and Vicksburg in the West. So that really sets the stage for what is going to be happening for the rest of 1863 in both theaters. And again, more of what I'm going to talk about tonight in the Eastern Theater ends up being not necessarily battles, but other things that certainly are of interest to how the war is going and how the Union is faring, and is the Union going to, in fact, win the war? So just 10 days after the Union victory at Gettysburg, we have the New York City draft riots. So the United States had incorporated a military draft. They were starting to conscript people to get drafted into the Army, and there were a lot of people that were not happy about that for various reasons. They didn't want to leave home, of course. They were scared. They had a farm they had to run. They had a family, whatever the case may be. So in New York City, there, of course, was a very large immigrant population. There also was a large free black population. And there had been tensions between certain immigrant groups and free black men and women and families before. In July of 1863, this all kind of comes to a head in the New York City draft riots. So the reason for the rioting, the reason for this event to begin was rebellion against this idea of conscription, but it really kind of eventually turned into something much uglier than that, which was really kind of turned into like a race riot almost. So many white working class people in New York were unhappy about conscription. They didn't, like the idea that now the war wasn't just about saving the Union. Now the war was also, because we're talking about July of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect 7 months before. Now the war definitely is about also not just saving the Union, but also freeing enslaved people. And so there's a lot of discontent about that, a lot of people that don't want to fight for that. They're happy to maybe fight to save the Union, but not so much to free enslaved people. There's also a lot of anger among the working class that wealthy people under this conscription law could in fact pay for a substitute. So if you got drafted, if you had the money, you could find some other guy to take your place. Does anyone know which future president of the United States paid for a substitute so he didn't have to fight in the Civil War? It wasn't James Garfield. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland actually did this. He paid for a substitute, which was legal, and he sent somebody else to war. And I did read one time about, I believe that guy did survive the war and then tried to, he tried to sort of get an audience with Cleveland at some point, and Cleveland, I don't know if I can't remember how the story went down, but I think the guy lived and did try to get in touch with Cleveland later, and I'm not sure how that went. But anyway, Cleveland did do that. So he was just one example of many. But this obviously, for understandable reasons, really ticked off the working class because they couldn't, if they got drafted, they couldn't afford to pay a substitute. So there was a lot of anger about that. And again, it eventually turned ugly, eventually started becoming something of a race riot. A lot of free black men and women were attacked. And as you see on the screen there, they even burned what was called the Colored Orphan Asylum. So again, this was just several days of just rampant rioting and everything in New York City. About 120 people were killed, including 5 black men who were basically lynched, hanged, and somewhere between $1 and $5 million in property damage. Troops who had just come off the battlefield at Gettysburg were actually diverted from being sent somewhere else to go to New York City and help try to put down the New York City draft riots. So this is a major event. Again, not so much a battle, but a major civil and political event in the Eastern Theater in 1863. Next, of course, most of you probably know about this. Everybody's probably seen the movie Glory, which came out when I was like a junior or a senior in high school. And that movie's really old now, so what does that mean about me? Well, I'll let you do the math on that. But at any rate, July 18th, 1863, this is the event that is portrayed as the climax of that movie, where the 54th Massachusetts, the first real all-black regiment that was really formed even before the U.S. colored troops were raised and organized. As soon as the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, there were free black men in New England and from other parts of the country too, going to New England to try to enlist so that they could fight. I mean, who had more to win or lose in the Civil War than black men, black people? So the 54th Massachusetts is raised. And of course, there's a great quote here. This is one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny he has earned the right to citizenship." So a great quote from Douglass, who also put his money where his mouth was, so to speak. 2 of his sons actually ended up serving in the 54th, one of whom was wounded in the attack on Fort Wagner that you remember from the end of the movie Glory. So the significance here is this is the first real experience, real national exposure that most people have to the idea of black men fighting in uniform, fighting to serve the Union, fighting to beat the Confederacy, fighting to put down a rebellion or an insurrection or whatever you want to call it, and keeping the Union together, and now fighting for their own freedom and their own citizenship. By the time the war ended, almost 200,000 black men had fought for the Union in the Army and the Navy, and about 37,000 of them were killed. We have several Black Medal of Honor recipients during the Civil War as well. So black men served with distinction and were absolutely critical to increasing the manpower available to the Union to fight the war. This is not a source of manpower that is available to the South. They are not going to arm enslaved black men and tell them to go fight. There's talk about it in the South really at the very end of the war, but the war ends before it really is ever able to go anywhere. So, the North has this advantage. They've got more people anyway. They also now have an additional source of men to be soldiers when they begin to allow black men to fight. So John mentioned this at the beginning. So we have Morgan's raid. So I'll be the first to admit, until I moved to Ohio in 2009, I had no idea that there was ever any Civil War action in Ohio. I knew about Gettysburg, of course, which is Pennsylvania. I knew about Maryland, but I had no idea that there ever was any actual Civil War action in Ohio, but in fact there was, and in southern Indiana, as you can see as well. So John Hunt Morgan was a Confederate cavalry commander, very well known, very highly regarded. And he kind of comes up with this idea to basically divert Union attention from what's going on in Tennessee, trying to really just make the Union pay attention to something else so Confederate forces can have some time to make some moves in Tennessee. And of course, John's going to talk more about that here shortly. So he conceives of this cavalry raid up through the north. It's very Jeb Stuart-esque, if you will. If you know anything about Jeb Stuart, the famous Confederate cavalry commander, he loved to ride around the Union Army and cause all this upheaval. So Morgan conceives of really the same idea here. So he leaves Tennessee down there at the bottom. You see Sparta, Tennessee at the bottom, goes up through Kentucky. Kentucky is a border state. So that's, a delicate bit of business getting up there through Kentucky, because there are pro-Confederates in Kentucky, but there's lots of pro-Unionists in Kentucky too. So that is not as simple as it may seem to, ride through Kentucky. Then on up into southern Indiana, and then on into southern, and then on up further into Ohio. So Indiana and Ohio are both really interesting. Obviously both Union states, but there are pockets of Confederate sympathizers in the southern parts of both of these states because of their proximity to the South, because they're so close to Kentucky. Kentucky is still a slave state, even though it never joined the Confederacy. It is a slave state. So there were plenty of people who had left Kentucky at some point and then headed on up into Indiana and Ohio. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln, his own family. He's born in Kentucky. He moved to Indiana, southern Indiana, as a young man before the family went on to Illinois, where he's most famously associated. But there was plenty of pro-Confederate sentiment in southern Indiana and southern Ohio even. And so, Morgan is kind of moving through some areas at least where he probably does have at least some sympathizers. But then he, makes his way all the way up further into Ohio and eventually is captured. Now, before he's captured, he does do a fair amount of damage, captures and paroles about 6,000 Union soldiers, destroys bridges, disrupts railroads, diverts U.S. troops from other duties, and stole thousands of horses as well. Burned down businesses, burned down homes. So he did a fair amount of damage before he's finally captured. I'm assuming it's pronounced Salineville, or is it Salineville? I don't know. Up in sort of central Ohio, I guess, on July 26, 1863. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and they ask about Civil War actions that took place in Ohio, now you know. And actually, we're going to mention Morgan again here at the end, so we're not done with Morgan quite yet. After the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, you all know Gettysburg is a loss for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee is perhaps, in my mind at least, maybe a little overconfident at Gettysburg, and so he orders Pickett's charge that John mentioned at the beginning. where he sends, 12,000 men again, across a mile of open ground, confident that these men have performed great feats before, they can do it again. Well, it didn't work out this time for the Army of Northern Virginia. And eventually Lee, about 4 or 5 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, he actually feels that maybe he should resign. He should not command the Army of Northern Virginia anymore. So this is an excerpt from the letter he sent to Jefferson Davis, of course, the president of the Confederacy, talking about maybe it's time for him to shuffle off and make room for somebody else to command the Confederate Army. I sensibly feel the growing failure of my bodily strength. I have not yet recovered from the attack I experienced this past spring. This was an attack, I think it was angina. It was something, he was on the way towards having heart disease, which is what eventually killed him just, 5 or 6 years after the war ended. I'm becoming more and more incapable of exertion. I'm thus prevented from making the personal examinations and giving the personal supervision to the operations I feel to be necessary. Everything, therefore, points to the advantages to be derived from a new commander. And I the more anxiously urge the matter upon your excellency for my belief that a younger and abler man than myself can be readily attained. I mean, Lee is 57, 58, something like that at this point. I mean, not young, but not old. Certainly in this era when maybe the life expectancy isn't quite what it is today, he would be considered a little bit older than we would think of somebody who's 57 or 58 today. But he's still not an old man by any means. But he's starting to feel physically that maybe he can't do it anymore. And even though he doesn't really mention it here, he feels great sorrow and guilt for the way that the Battle of Gettysburg ended, because the whole idea for going to invade the North for the second time was to try to get up there and fight a decisive battle and try to end this war. And Lee again is very confident in his men. They've done amazing things before, but this time he miscalculates. They lose. And so, he feels guilty about that. So he's basically doing what he thinks he needs to do. One, because of how he feels physically, but also because of his responsibility as the commander of this army. Needless to say, Jefferson Davis does not accept Lee's resignation. And as we all know, Lee does command the Army of Northern Virginia until the end of the war, eventually surrendering to Grant in April of 1865. So Lee does offer the resignation here in August of 1863, but he does not, in fact, it is not accepted. Lincoln probably would have loved it if some of those generals that he had would have offered their resignations and he could have said, thanks very much, I'll take it and I'll find somebody else. But in this case, Jefferson Davis knew that there was no better strategic and tactical mind available to him in the South than Robert E. Lee. And so he, of course, did not accept Lee's resignation, and Lee continued on in his role. Now, I'm supposed to be talking about the East. And so when John and I were talking about this yesterday, just making sure we had all of our ducks in a row for tonight, I said, I just realized that I have a slide in here about something that took place really more in the West. Do you want me to delete that? And he was kind enough to say, no, just it's already in there, go ahead. So the raid on Lawrence, Kansas, I recognize Kansas is not really considered the Eastern theater here, but for some reason, as I was making this PowerPoint, it didn't strike me until yesterday when John and I were talking that, oh gosh, this is not really the East, but I'll mention it anyway. So William Quantrill's raid on Lawrence, Kansas. So Missouri, of course, is also, like Kentucky that I mentioned a minute ago, a border state. So it's a state that has slavery, but has not seceded, has not joined the Confederacy. And Lincoln, of course, for the duration of the war, is very concerned about the border states. He wants to keep those border states in the Union, because if they go over to the Confederacy, that's just more men and material that the Confederacy will have to them. And you may have heard the famous quote Lincoln made. He says it about Kentucky, but it's really applicable to all the border states, which is, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. And so he could have said the same about Missouri or Delaware or Maryland as well. But at any rate, Lawrence, Kansas, if anybody's here, I used to live in Nebraska, southeastern Nebraska, and so I've been down to Lawrence several times. So Lawrence, Kansas is really just over the border from Missouri. It's right all kind of in the Kansas City area. So Kansas, if you remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, then we have Bleeding Kansas in 1856. Kansas was a real sort of flashpoint for violence and for the pro and anti-slavery politics prior to the Civil War. Well, now that we're into the Civil War, we're into mid-1863, things are still not, things that those emotions and those actions are still going on out in that part of the country. So Lawrence is a free state town that is constantly sort of in conflict with these, what they call border ruffians, these pro-Confederate, pro-slavery settlers coming over from the Missouri side. And one of the most notorious of those is William Quantrill, who you see in the photo here with this fancy mustache. Looks like a real dapper fellow here, but in fact he was a pretty brutal fighter. So on August 21st, 1863. Quantrill and about 400 of his raiders, these sort of irregulars as they're called, guerrillas, call them whatever you want, ride from the Missouri side over into Lawrence, Kansas, and they raid the town of Lawrence. They kill almost 200 men and boys. Of course, they target men and boys because those are the people who could potentially go fight. They also purposely targeted and attacked free black men who did live in Lawrence, because Kansas was a free state. It had come into the Union as a free state, but because of its proximity to Missouri, there was still plenty of conflict here with guys like Quantrill. They burned down homes and businesses. Citizens had to hide, and this was just an absolutely brutal attack, one of the most violent guerrilla or irregular attacks of the entire Civil War. And it was purposely committed against civilians. So, we later in 1864, we get Sherman's March to the Sea. And, if you go down to certain parts of the South today in Georgia, they still have signs up about Sherman and all his men being, rapists and war criminals and all this stuff. And it turns out that was actually, they were pretty restrained. They could have been a lot worse than they were. But then you get a guy like Quantrill, who in fact was pretty brutal and pretty, drew a lot of blood in cases like this, the attack on Lawrence in August of '63. Again, not really in the East, but since I had the slide in there, I thought I'd better at least explain what I meant. So we talked a minute ago about the Union attack on Battery Wagner, Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor on Morris Island. That's the attack that was made by the 54th Massachusetts, the end of the movie Glory. So after that attack, the Union decided, they probably could not take this particular Confederate stronghold by land. It just wasn't going to work. So they bring in this guy, Quincy Gilmore, from Ohio, by the way, first in his class at West Point in 1849. And Gilmore, who is an engineer, is charged with figuring out a way to take Morris Island, to take Battery Wagner, which is right here. And so Gilmore eventually decides the way to do this is from the sea, is a naval bombardment. And so soon after the attack on Fort Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts, which did not succeed, Gilmore orders this naval bombardment. And they basically just pound Morris Island, pound Battery Wagner for 2 months almost, before finally on September 7th, 1863, the Confederates evacuate Battery Wagner and Morris Island. And that was primarily because of this naval bombardment. We're talking about Charleston here, folks. We're talking about South Carolina. We're talking about the very place where secession was born. So the Union is always very, very interested in doing as much damage as it can in South Carolina, because South Carolina, as my high school history teacher said, every problem we ever had in this country started in South Carolina. I don't really know if that's true or not. And if anybody here's from South Carolina, I apologize. But I remember him saying that very distinctly, and this was 30-some years ago. It has stuck in my head all these years. But at any rate, really, we're talking about the cradle of secession here. South Carolina, or as who was it that said, South Carolina, too small to be its own country and too large to be an insane asylum. It's another great quote that I like. But anyway, this is a really considered a pretty important victory for the Union, where here they are in Charleston Harbor, near Fort Sumter, where the war started, and they're finally able to kick Confederates out of that Battery Wagner, which again also was important because it was the place where black men first fought under fire for the Union. So now we move into October of 1863. Again, like I said, not a lot of battles here, although there are a couple coming up. And we're a little over 2 weeks from Thanksgiving now. This is where the national Thanksgiving that we celebrate every year on the fourth Thursday in November comes from. This is from a proclamation that Abraham Lincoln issued in October of 1863, calling for a national day of Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday. I invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next, which of course is what we still do, fourth Thursday in November, as a day of thanksgiving. Recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him, talking about God of course, they do also with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife in which we are unavoidably engaged. So basically, you know, we're trying to appeal to God not only to offer thanks for the victories that we've had, but also maybe, offer our penance for the situation that we as imperfect human beings, of course, have created. So anyway, this is where we get the national Thanksgiving. All the way back to George Washington, of course, there had been various proclamations of Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving, days set aside as a day of Thanksgiving. But this is where the Thanksgiving that we now enjoy every year. He doesn't say anything in here about there must be at least 3 football games. The Detroit Lions have to play every year. I don't know where that came from. If that, that was not presidentially proclaimed, but apparently it is the case. But at any rate, this is where we get the national, the idea of the national Thanksgiving that we celebrate every year towards the end of November. And just as on a personal aside, my wedding anniversary is November 27th. So every now and then, our wedding anniversary falls on Thanksgiving. And of course, the first question I always ask my wife is, well, are you still thankful? And I probably should stop asking, but if I may not like the answer. But at any rate, yeah, that does happen every now and then at my house. It's kind of fun. So now we got an actual battle, not a huge battle, but important because we're really talking here about still dealing with the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, that huge battle that took place in July. Robert E. Lee, of course, the Army of Northern Virginia escapes after Gettysburg, withdraws back to Virginia, is not pursued by the Army of the Potomac, led by George Gordon Meade. So Meade wins this great victory at Gettysburg for the Union after being in command for like 3 days. He had just been assigned command of the Army when the battle was starting practically. But he then, immediately falls into some of, in Lincoln's mind at least, bad habits that befall all of the Union commanders in the East, at least, that Lincoln's been dealing with, which is he doesn't follow up the victory. And Lincoln is telling Meade after Gettysburg, pursue Lee. This is the chance. Crush his army. This could bring an end to the war. And Meade is not moving as quickly as Lincoln would like. So Meade eventually pursues Lee. Meade pursues Lee back into Virginia. And this is really sort of a follow-up from that, even though Gettysburg is 3 months in the past at this point. So the Union Army is kind of withdrawing. They've been chasing Lee. Now they're kind of starting to pull back a little bit. A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia up here basically attacks a very large Union force led by General G.K. Warren, Gouverneur K. Warren, who's the savior of Little Round Top. If you know your Gettysburg history at all, he's the guy whose statue is up there on Little Round Top. And Hill kind of plunges into this battle without doing any reconnaissance at all, which is not a great idea. And we find out why it's not such a great idea, because he gets beat. And it turns into turns into a rout for the Confederacy. And Lee is very unhappy. And, Robert E. Lee is a guy who, very pious, very religious, very kind to his subordinates. This is one of those times when he, for Lee at least, kind of lost his temper a little bit. And he told Hill, he basically told Hill, you blew it here. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But you didn't conduct a reconnaissance. How could you not check out the ground and check out the enemy force in front of you before you commit troops to fight? Bury your dead and say no more about it. And that's a tongue lashing from Robert E. Lee. It's kind of like, the same tongue lashing he gave to Jeb Stuart when Stuart finally showed up at Gettysburg. Just that, you've let us down and we're not going to talk about it anymore. And then, maybe he gives him the silent treatment or something. I don't know. But really, from Lee, this is kind of a tongue lashing. So Hill definitely lost some prestige in the eyes of Robert E. Lee in this particular battle. And you can see the casualties there, very one-sided. So that, the Union takes 540 casualties, much, much higher for the Confederacy with almost 1,400 casualties. This is Bristoe Station, October 14th, 1863. Now, here's probably my favorite slide. I know nothing about naval history. I freely admit that. Whether it's Civil War or World War II or whatever, I don't know a lot of naval history. But I know about the Hunley, the CSS Hunley, which of course is the first real combat submarine. So I was telling, John and I were talking yesterday, and I told him that, just researching this slide, I learned a ton that I didn't know. So I was really glad I got to do this. First of all, I did not realize that, I knew that the Hunley sank. And I remember when they raised the Hunley back in 2000, it was huge news. And, the crew, the remains of the crew were still in there and all this stuff. I did not realize that the Hunley actually, that was the third time the Hunley had sunk. It sank 3 times. The first 2, they actually recovered it, fixed it, and sent it back out. I didn't know that. I think that's fascinating. The other thing I find fascinating is, forget everything you've seen in movies about, submarines in World War II or whatever. The Hunley, the Confederate submarine Hunley, which is named for H.L. Hunley, who was the inventor, did not have the ability to fire torpedoes like we think of today with a submarine, where, you're firing from, 2 miles away or something, trying to hit another ship. This is a torpedo in Civil War submarine times. The torpedo is attached to the submarine. So the submarine is underwater floating with this giant thing sticking out in front of it. That's the torpedo. And how do you attack another ship? You get close enough to slam that thing into the hull of the other ship. I would never do this. I am so glad I didn't join the Navy. I would never have done this. This is crazy. But this is what the Hunley did. So on October 15th, 1863, it sank for the second time, killed its inventor Hunley, killed the whole crew. The Confederacy raised it one more time, fixed it, and sent it out. And on February 17th, 1864, they used this crazy setup and they sank the USS Housatonic, which was the first ship in world history to be sunk by a submarine. But when the Hunley slammed this thing into the hull of the Housatonic, damaged the Union ship, it sunk, it killed everybody inside the Hunley too. So when they finally recovered the Hunley in 2000, I went deep into this thing, man. Let me tell you, I started reading this woman's doctoral dissertation on the Hunley. Of course, the remains of the crew were still in there, and they said they could tell the crew there was no attempt to escape or anything. These guys did not drown. They were killed in the explosion by what you would basically, I can only describe as like the concussion. So the concussion, or what they called an air draft, was so severe it caused pulmonary and brain trauma and killed them all instantly. So by sinking the Housatonic with this crazy torpedo setup, they also killed themselves. So anyway, so the sinking of the Hunley on October 15th, 1863 is not the interesting one, but it gave me an excuse to talk about it because I just found this whole thing so fascinating. And again, if there's any, Submariner, Veterans Day is later this week. I was in the Army. I'm glad I was not in the Navy because there is no way I would be able to do this. I never thought of myself as being claustrophobic, but when I saw this graphic, I just thought, nope, this was definitely not for me. So anyway, but that's the sinking of the Hunley. The October 15th, 1863 sinking is the second one that kills Hunley himself and the crew, but they raise it one more time, and then it goes out in February of 1864. Destroys the Housatonic, but destroys it itself as well. So then on November 19th, 1863, there's this very minor event in Gettysburg where they decide to dedicate a cemetery, and Abraham Lincoln gives this speech. My favorite line from this whole speech is, "The world will little note nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Obviously, this is now one of, if not the most studied, most quoted speeches in human history, not just American history, in human history. And if you want to know more about the Gettysburg Address, I am not going to tell you about it right now. I'm going to invite you to come back tomorrow at noon because our monthly Civil War talk is tomorrow, and I will be doing a line-by-line deconstruction of this whole address, telling you what was he thinking, what did he mean by this. And I could do that now, but it would cut into John's time, and I don't want to do that, but I also don't want all of you to not come tomorrow. So come back tomorrow at noon, right here, same bat time, same bat channel, as they say, and we'll talk more about the Gettysburg Address. But this is obviously a critical event in American history, in the history of the Civil War. And again, it is one of, if not the most quoted, most studied speeches in human history, not just American history. The Battle of Mine Run, again, another smaller battle here, but still somewhat important. This is also in Virginia. We're getting on towards the end of the year, and of course, in the era of the Civil War, there were some, but there weren't a ton of winter battles. Armies, for the most part, would go into winter camps because it was so hard to maneuver in the wintertime. So here we're getting into late November, early December. Meade's Army of the Potomac trying to march through the old Wilderness and Spotsylvania battlefields that we mentioned here at the beginning, trying to go after Lee's right flank. Several days of fighting and maneuvering that were basically inconclusive. It's one of those battles where you just lament that anybody had to die in this battle because it really accomplished nothing. And then here's Lee once again. I am too old to command this army. So he's sort of reiterating that sentiment that he expressed in that letter that he wrote to Jefferson Davis in August when he was offering to resign from command. We never should have let those people get away. Of course, those people being the Union forces who were able to get away and then just go into winter camp. Interesting little fun fact here. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, if you know the poem Christmas Bells, or you know the very popular Christmas hymn, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day, which is based on that poem. He wrote that right around the time of this battle when he learned that one of his sons had been severely wounded fighting at Mine Run. So that's where you get I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And then I'll tell you too that if you come down the street to the Garfield home and you go on one of our house tours, you see there's a sizable picture of Longfellow in the Memorial Library. He actually sent a book of his poetry signed to Mrs. Garfield after President Garfield's death, which we have in our collection now. So we do have a great connection to Longfellow down the street as well. I also promised you we'd come back to John Hunt Morgan. So Morgan, who again led that daring cavalry raid out of Tennessee through Kentucky, southern Indiana, all the way up into Ohio before he was captured in July of 1863. He and his men are imprisoned in Columbus at the Ohio State Penitentiary. And on November 27th, 1863, several of them escape. Hunt, Morgan, and about 6 or 7 others escape. They kind of tunnel down. It makes me think of the Shawshank Redemption, if you've seen that movie where, the guy's tunneling out. Oh, maybe I just ruined it for somebody. Sorry. If you've never seen it, it's really good, but I won't say anything else. Anyway, they tunneled from an air shaft beneath their cells, and they basically came out in the prison yard and then had to scale the walls to get over the walls of the prison. So Morgan and 4 of the others that escaped with him actually made it. They didn't get caught and re-imprisoned. And then less than a year later, Morgan, of course, goes back into the Confederate service, and then less than a year later, he's killed in action in Tennessee. So Morgan does not survive the war. And then the last slide I have, and then we'll turn it over to John to talk about all the stuff going on in the West, is this is just a quote from Lincoln's third annual message to Congress. So the annual message to Congress today we think of as the State of the Union. The president goes to the Capitol and speaks to Congress, speaks to the American people, and tells them what's going on in the country, and has all these ideas about how we can make things better or whatever. This was primarily presented in written form up until there were, I believe, Washington and Adams both presented it in person, and then Jefferson as the third president, thought that was a little too smacked of monarchy, and so he decided to submit it in writing. And that was continued until, well into the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson maybe was the next one to actually go in person and speak. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was Wilson. Anyway, so Lincoln's third annual message to Congress. And this is really a very short quote, believe it or not, because this is a very long report, and it's mostly dull reading where he's talking about, this year that the post office did this, and we brought in this much money in the post office, and the Department of Agriculture did this. So it's not, scintillating reading by any means, but I just thought it was interesting here that he mentioned, Of those who were slaves at the beginning of the rebellion, fully 100,000 are now in the United States military service, about one half of which number actually bear arms in the ranks, thus giving the double advantage of taking so much labor from the insurgent cause, meaning the Confederacy, of course, and supplying the places which otherwise must be filled with so many white men. So far as tested, it is difficult to say they are not as good soldiers as any. No servile insurrection or tendency to violence or cruelty has marked the measures of emancipation and arming the blacks, his words. These measures have been much discussed in foreign countries, and contemporary with such discussion, the tone of public sentiment there is much improved. So Lincoln is saying a lot right here. First of all, he's acknowledging the Emancipation Proclamation has been in effect for almost a year. We have 100,000 black men now fighting for our cause, fighting to save the Union, fighting for their own freedom, for their own opportunity to be citizens. But he also acknowledges, too, that there was a lot of worry on the Union side about foreign powers, primarily Britain and France, coming in supporting the Confederacy. And so he kind of makes a little allusion there too about these measures have been much discussed in foreign countries, and contemporary with such discussion, tone of public sentiment there is much improved. That's his way of saying, now that we've made the war a crusade to defeat slavery as well as save the Union, foreign powers are not as inclined to come in and fight against us, because Britain and France do not want to come in and say they are fighting to preserve slavery. So that's a neat allusion to what to that there. So anyway, so that's Lincoln's third annual message to Congress. And then I'll close with something that's not on any of my slides, and then I'll turn it over to John, which is one of my favorite Lincoln quotes, which is actually from one of his other annual messages to Congress, I think the year before this one, 1862. But as a historian, it's one of my favorite quotes, where he says, he writes in his annual message to Congress, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves." I think that's a good place for me to stop. John, it's all yours.
So it's kind of weird to talk about Tennessee as the West, but it is, as far as this is concerned. Although there's a whole part of the Civil War that doesn't get discussed really all that much, and it's the fighting that happened. I mean, there's a battle in what is now New Mexico, and there was a series of engagements fought in West Texas and points further west. A really nasty series of engagements involving usually small numbers, and it was just guys running around in the desert trying not to die of thirst and occasionally taking a few pot shots at each other. But as far as this goes, so Tennessee is a sort of interesting case in the history of the Civil War. Tennessee was very pronouncedly divided in the lead up to the Civil War. There was a sort of segment of the Unionists, the Republicans, or sort of the former Whigs, it was a combination of the two, that were sort of constitutional Unionists, and basically what they thought was, let's save the Union and kind of we'll see if we can find a way around slavery one way or another. But they thought that the Republicans were being too doctrinaire about their opposition to slavery. But so this is map of the red counties being the sort of pro-slavery ones, very heavily weighted toward western Tennessee. The eastern counties, especially around Knoxville, tended to be heavily pro-Union. Lincoln had a great deal of solicitude for the eastern part of Tennessee. He was constantly trying to get his generals, like, we need to get into eastern Tennessee to give sort of succor to the population there who are loyal Unionists. So he wanted them to move toward Knoxville. He also wanted them to take Chattanooga. In 1862, Lincoln told one of his associates that the capture of Chattanooga would be as important as the capture of Richmond. Now, of course, Lincoln understood that the capture of Richmond wasn't necessarily all that important if the Army of Northern Virginia was still running around in some other place. But he did think that the capture of Chattanooga would be important because Chattanooga was, in a lot of respects, the gateway to parts of the South that had been, to this point, untouched by the ravages of war in the way that Central Virginia had been. I mean, a large proportion of the Civil War is fought out in Virginia, in Tennessee, as we're about to see. So the first half of 1863, pretty much, General Rosecrans, the Union commander, is hanging out in Murfreesboro and fortifying it. It was the fortifications around there came to be called sort of unofficially Fortress Rosecrans. Rosecrans was a rather genial man, but he was a very careful commander. And what he really wanted to do was equip himself with as much supplies as he possibly could. So one Union volunteer later remembered that at one point he was at some place around Murfreesboro in the Union supply area, and he saw 40,000 cases of hard bread all piled up at one place. And this was a matter of great annoyance to Lincoln, to Henry Halleck, the commander of the army, and they kept trying to get him to move. And they kept sort of saying, okay, you know, and Rosecrans would send back these sort of messages. Yes, you know, we're almost ready. My preparations are almost ready. And it went on for so long. Finally, Lincoln sends him this letter. I would not push you to any rashness, but I am very anxious that you do your utmost, short of rashness, to keep Bragg from getting lost to help Johnston against Grant. So Lincoln knew that the commander of the Confederate forces, Braxton Bragg, was hanging out sort of in southern Tennessee, Tullahoma. And what he was afraid was going to happen was that if Rosecrans continued to do nothing, that some of Braxton Bragg's army would be sliced off and sent to help in the defense of Vicksburg, which of course also Lincoln was very interested in seeing reduced. But Rosecrans sent him back a letter saying, well, actually, the fact that I'm doing nothing is keeping Bragg here. If I were to move, then he might decamp with his entire army to Mississippi, thus putting greater pressure on Grant. So in fact, I'm doing the right thing by staying here. And finally, there was a sort of, every time Halleck would send Rosecrans these notes, Rosecrans would send back usually several telegrams saying, I'm about to move, I'm right on the verge, but here's some more supply requisitions. And finally, Halleck got so annoyed with Rosecrans that he said, could you possibly stop sending so many telegrams, because the volume of the telegrams that you're sending is actually a drag on the military budget. So here's where Rosecrans is at Murfreesboro, and here is where Braxton Bragg is with about 40,000 Confederate troops at Tullahoma. It was the first half of 1863 was a very wet spring and a very wet summer, and General Hardee, one of the commanders on Bragg's staff, one of his subordinates later wrote that the Tullahoma, the name of the town that they were stationed at, the name came from two Greek words, tulla meaning mud, and homa meaning more mud. And Bragg too was not having a very good time of it. His wife became gravely ill, and this is an unfortunate thing for Braxton Bragg, because she was probably the only person in about 4 states who really liked him. Bragg was an unlikable person. There's Rosecrans right there. I've read, and I'm not sure that this is the case, but so you'll often see generals with their hands stuck inside their jacket, and a lot of times it's a kind of reference to Napoleon, who was painted with his hand stuck inside his jacket, probably because he had an ulcer and his stomach really hurt. But here's Braxton Bragg too. Bragg was rather an unpleasant person, given to fits of rage and dressing down his officers. He did not suffer fools or really anybody very gladly. During this campaign, he was suffering from a bad case of boils, which at one point during the shift from Tullahoma down to Chattanooga, he had to just take the train. He couldn't ride his horse anymore because the boils were so bad. Like, war in the 19th century was just pretty unpleasant. But finally, around the end of June, Rosecrans finally sort of bestirs himself. And as usual, he doesn't, I mean, first of all, he didn't really tell Lincoln or anyone in the government. He said to Lincoln, we're going to move soon. And then he didn't really tell him what he was going to do. But what he came up with was a sort of a 3-pronged attack, moving southward, McCook moving sort of more directly southward, George Thomas moving centrally, and then Crittenden heading northwest, and his sort of, or northeast, excuse me. These guys all read the same military theory, and they're all like, well, I'm going to do this sort of double envelopment in which I'll like capture the whole and we'll fight this sort of epochal final battle, which never ever happens. I mean, these things, if you read the history of the Civil War, you can just keep a scorecard of the number of times somebody's like, well, here's what we'll do. We'll have this envelopment. We'll have another Cannae. That's like the sort of great Roman battle that they're always sort of looking back to, which never comes off. And the interesting thing about this is they're in sort of the hill country in central eastern Tennessee. By the way, a few weeks ago, I went to a friend of mine's wedding in Baltimore, and I ended up driving through central Pennsylvania because I was disinclined to drive to pay the tolls on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And it's those of you, many of you have probably driven around there. It's beautiful country, but it's central Pennsylvania looks like someone just sort of grabbed it and pushed it together accordion style. So it's a series of these parallel ridges. And I thought to myself, my God, who would be an infantryman in the Civil War and just be like, oh, here's another one, like just humping up and down those ridges. And a lot of this part of Tennessee, and especially in the Cumberland Plateau, is like that too. But so here we meet one of the sort of interesting minor characters in this whole thing, and he's a captain named John Wilder. Rosecrans had been complaining for a long time that he didn't have enough cavalry. So finally, he decides that there are a couple of units of infantry who've said, well, we'd be interested in being cavalry if you can supply us with horses. So they supplied them with horses and mules too. Wilder did this mostly out of his own pocket. And he also supplied them with this weapon, this is why I said Spencer, the Spencer repeating carbine. Now, this is different than the 1861 Springfield rifled musket, which is the weapon of choice of the vast majority of, not choice, it was what they were given, Civil War soldiers. Springfield 1861 rifled musket fires a .58 caliber soft lead slug. Well handled, you can probably get off 3 shots in a minute. It's a muzzle loader. You got to load the powder. You got to pack it down. And when things are going on around you, it's got to be a little distracting. But 3 shots, well handled, you can get off a shot about every 20 seconds. This weapon fires a .52 caliber slug. It has a clip, basically. There's a kind of a long cylindrical thing that goes in the end of the butt and holds 7 rounds. And when you sort of cock it with this thing, and that also discharges the used casing. The rate of fire of this weapon is 14 to 21 rounds in a minute, assuming it didn't misfire. You don't have to be too good at math to figure out what the difference here is. So suppose you're in a group of about, say, 250 guys, which is a pretty standard number for a somewhat understrength Civil War regiment. In the first minute of your engagement, if you're all operating with these Springfield muskets, you can get off about 700 to 750 shots, assuming you're all really pushing to it, and you've been in this a few times, which is not always the case. Say there's 250 of you armed with these Spencer repeaters. You can get off between 4,000 and 5,000 shots in the first minute. First minute of an engagement, assuming, once again, no misfires and you're all, doing what you're supposed to do. So that volume of fire really changes the equation. So Wilder outfits these guys out of his own pocket. The federal government was very hinky about these new weapons, and you can kind of understand why, because armies tend to be on the conservative side. They tend to go with what they know, right? And what do they know? They know that the Springfield musket works. Right? And they know that God help you if you get hit by one of these shells. It's like, or one of these mini balls, because it's going to take a big chunk out of you. And you know that it's a relatively dependable weapon. And the federal arsenals are set up to make these weapons. But he outfits his unit all out of his own pocket, and he convinced the guys in it to repay him out of their own pay packets. So they would pay him a small amount of money with the promise that the government would eventually repay them. This is one of the, sometimes you think about the sort of like psychology of these guys, what would it take if the guy comes to you and proposes this idea to you? So check it out. But of course, they love these guns. And so they make a run for one of these gaps in the series of ridges dividing Murfreesboro from Tullahoma, a place called Hoover Gap. One of the majors in this brigade described it thus: "As soon as the enemy opened up on us with their artillery, we dismounted and formed a line of battle on a hill just south of the entrance of the gap. And our battery of light artillery was opened on them. A courier was dispatched to the rear to hurry up reinforcements. Our horses were sent back some distance, out of the way of the bursting shells. Our regiment was assigned to support the battery. 3 other regiments were properly disposed, and not a moment too soon, for these preparations were scarcely completed when the enemy opened on us with a terrific fire of shot and shell from 5 different points, and their masses of infantry, with flags flying, moved out of the woods on our right in a splendid style. There were 3 or 4 times our number already in sight, and still others came pouring out of the woods beyond. Our regiment lay on the hillside in mud and water. It was raining like hell when this happened. As a matter of fact, in the course of the marches during this Tullahoma campaign, one Illinois infantryman remembered that it rained the entire time, and it wasn't some Presbyterian rain. It was a real Baptist rain. Our regiment lay on the hill in mud and water, the rain pouring down in torrents, while each shell screamed so close as to make it seem that the next would tear us to pieces. By the way, there's another thing. The powder's contained in the cartridge. So you don't have to worry about standing around in the rain. Is your powder going to actually work when it comes down to powder has to get kind of wet to not work right, but it does, and that can have unfortunate consequences of which I'm sure you can extrapolate. Well, each shell screamed so close as to make it seem the next would tear us to pieces. Presently, the enemy got near enough to make a charge on our battery, and they came on. Our men are on their feet, and in an instant, a terrible fire from the Spencers causes the advancing regiment to reel and its colors to fall to the ground. But in an instant, their colors are up again, and on they come, thinking to reach the battery before our guns can be reloaded. Oops. But they reckoned without the host. They did not know that we had the Spencers. And their charging yell was answered with another terrible volley, and another, without cessation, until the poor regiment was literally cut to pieces. And but a few men of that 20th Tennessee that attempted the charge will ever charge again. So this is a real different experience, right? Because you're used to sort of, those of you who've looked at these battles will remember, there's that sort of moment in the Battle of Antietam in front of the Dunker Church when the Iron Brigade is slugging it out with the Carolina Confederates from a distance of really from where I'm standing to the back of this room at some points. It's so close that they're standing there, but you take a shot and then it's 20 seconds later that you take another one. So there's a sort of, now these guys can just sort of, unload this whole clip. It really changes the equation. So just to back up here for a moment, with the sort of unusual moment of alacrity that Rosecrans has, he manages to chase Bragg out of Tullahoma and back to Chattanooga. There, Bragg thinks, well, Chattanooga should be a really easy place to defend. It's got the Tennessee River as a sort of a moat in front of it. It's got some fairly high ground, so it should be a good sort of fortress that they can hold against the Union. But eventually, with more sort of movement, Rosecrans manages to get Bragg to back into North Georgia. Now, at this point, Bragg is a fairly aggressive commander, and he really is looking for a way to attack Rosecrans. He keeps getting sort of messages from the Confederate central government. We think that you need to be, more aggressive, and Bragg keeps sending back saying, well, look, I want to be, but I'm going to be aggressive in the place where I want to fight, not the place where Rosecrans wants to fight. And the place where he ends up fighting is a little place in North Georgia called Chickamauga. So you can see this is just across the Georgia line, just south of Chattanooga. By the way, in doing research for this, and I really, you'll notice these really lovely maps. These are all done by the American Battlefield Trust. I really recommend, if you're interested in learning about Civil War battles and don't want to read a 500-page book about it, which I'm inclined to do, but that's a whole other thing. American Battlefield Trust has some really great resources online, and they also have a really wonderful about 15-minute video that explains all the things that happened at the Battle of Chickamauga, of which I'm only going to sort of touch on a very few of them. So what's sort of happened is, at first, there's this, so this is Lookout Mountain here. There's a little sort of valley here called McLemore's Cove. Bragg's idea is that he's going to get the Union troops to get into McLemore's Cove, and then he's going to destroy them in detail. That you hear that, like, destroy them in detail is a phrase that you hear a lot in what these guys say to each other, or the messages between generals, because that's their theory is, we're going to bag the whole lot at one point. This is the real innovation that Grant brings to the fight. I mean, when he says in 1864, I intend to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, it's because he knows that the point is not The probability is not that he's going to trap Lee and wipe him out at one point, but that every man that Lee loses is more valuable to Lee than any man that Grant loses. This was a kind of horrifying sort of calculus, but it was something that Grant really understood, and why Grant was eventually the guy that brought the proceedings to or one important reason. This doesn't pan out, and what Bragg ends up with is a fairly large body of Union troops on his front in an area of woods and meadows. And this was the real sort of defining feature of the Battle of Chickamauga, is that most of the commanders of anything larger than a regiment couldn't see what was going on. There was no point that you could get to on the battlefield where you could see the whole stretch of what was going on. So what you can see here is this is McLemore's Cove down here, and this is the backside of Missionary Ridge. You can see Bragg sort of moving his troops into position, and Rosecrans has his sort of three-pronged force, and then he has Granger up here in reserve up at McAfee's Church, about 2 miles further north. The battle is really joined on September 19th, and what you see a lot of is heavy attacks on the Union left, partly undertaken by Forrest's cavalry troopers. And it's very alarming to Thomas, George Thomas is not a very easily alarmed man. He really is a very hard-nosed guy, but he keeps sort of sustaining attacks. This is basically the morning, and then you can kind of see this is the exact same. Another wonderful thing that the America Battlefield Trust does is puts out this series of maps that are on exactly the same scale, so you can see exactly that's where they were, this is where they are now. Things sort of, by the afternoon, things sort of peter out on the Union left, and Bragg starts to try and probe on the Union center along the Lafayette Road. There's some extremely heavy fighting along here, but Thomas keeps sort of sending messages to Rosecrans saying, well, I've taken a lot of pressure here, I need some reinforcements. Around dusk, Hood, Preston, Breckinridge start attacking on the Union right. Claiborne renews his attacks along the Brotherton Road on the Union left. On September 20th, Bragg decides that the real bulk of his force should be attacking the Union left, and Thomas once again sends to Rosecrans, and he says, what I think we need to do is move Brannan over to the left. So Rosecrans thinks that what this means is that Brannan is moving to the left to help Thomas. But Brannan wanted an explicit order from Rosecrans to actually do that. So things are a little chaotic around Rosecrans' headquarters, and he sends an order to Thomas Wood that he is to close up on Reynolds' flank. Now, he does not have his adjutant, James A. Garfield, compose this note. Garfield is composing orders to people on other parts of the battlefield. But he sends this note to Wood. There we go. There's Tom Wood. Wood was a little annoyed with Rosecrans because earlier that day, Rosecrans had, and not for the first time, dressed him down in front of his staff for failing to execute orders with sufficient alacrity. And so he gets this order, and he says to the courier, Brannan hasn't moved. And this order, what am I supposed to do with this? And the courier says, well, then the order is invalid. And Wood says, well, no. Rosecrans told me to go, and I'm going to go. And McCook, who's in the area, the other corps commander over there, says, well, look, I can work some guys in here. And Wood's like, nope, I'm going. I'm out of here. I've been ordered to go, and I'm going. Forget you. And he leaves, and he takes his troops over here to kind of behind where Reynolds is. By this time, too, Longstreet has showed up. Longstreet, by the way, had engineered a sort of transfer to this theater because he wanted to get rid of Braxton Bragg, because Longstreet didn't like Bragg and thought he was incompetent, which was a commonly held theory among Confederate commanders. Which is not, I mean, Bragg, I think, was in many respects a very competent commander, and he showed himself, he did a lot with not a lot of resources in North Georgia and southeastern Tennessee. But he was not held in very high regard. So at a certain point earlier, I think, they'd sent Joseph Johnston out to sort of survey his command, and I think the theory was that Johnston was going to replace him. And Johnston, who didn't think that much of Bragg, but also didn't like the idea of getting sent out as a sort of replacement, went out there, looked at Bragg's command and said, well, that's a pretty good order. Maybe I'll take command, but his wife is really sick and we don't want to kind of stir the pot right now. Anyway, Longstreet has set up an attack column stacked 5 deep. And as soon as Wood starts this very unfortunate movement, opening up a division-sized hole in the Union lines, Longstreet and Hood attack straight through it with unfortunate consequences. They basically wipe the Union right completely off the battlefield, and Rosecrans tries vainly to sort of recoup the situation, but he eventually is just forced back by the large number of Union troops who are voting with their feet in terms of what they think of this particular bit of strategizing. And he ends up going all the way back to Chattanooga. While this is happening, Granger has showed up. Also, while this is happening, Rosecrans sends James A. Garfield over to Thomas, has created this position on Snodgrass Ridge and is basically fending off Confederate attacks. And Garfield gets over there, and it's one of these sort of good news, bad news type of situations. I mean, you kind of imagine what the conversation must have been like. You know, Garfield saying, well, you know, I'd first like to congratulate you. You're doing a bang-up job over here, but the rest of the Union Army is gone now, and you're going to have to find some way to get out of here. Good luck with that. I'll see you in Chattanooga, hopefully. But Granger shows up as well. And Granger, when he gets there, this is one of the things I was looking up. This is one of my favorite sort of in-the-moment kind of quotes. Major General Gordon Granger shows up. Thomas says, well, can you charge the Confederates there? And Granger says, I have just the men for it. They're green and have no idea what's going to happen. But they do make a pretty good job of it. So what eventually happens is Thomas sort of realizes that he has to back off of, this is Horseshoe Ridge here, which is where the real Union defense here, and then there's Kelly's Meadow. They start backing off, and they have Turchin, who's a Russian emigre, and his division attack to cover their retreat. Turchin, I think, and most of his people are overwhelmed, but eventually they do make time for Thomas and the rest of his group to get back. Later on, after things had sort of shaken out, they asked Thomas, they were creating a military cemetery here on Snodgrass Hill, and he was asked by the chaplain who was overseeing it if he wanted the men buried there to be buried, to be divided up by the states that they came from. And to which Thomas famously said, no, mix them up. I'm tired of states' rights. This is Kelly's Meadow. You can see that. And then this is the Horseshoe Ridge. Poor old Rosecrans ends up back in Chattanooga. He gets there, he's exhausted, and he's distraught because things had been going pretty well. The Tullahoma campaign had been pretty good, but he's just psychologically a beaten man. Lincoln sends him this note, be of good cheer. We have unabated confidence in you and your soldiers and officers. In the main, you must be the judge of what is to be done. If I was to suggest, I would say have your army take a strong position until Burnside joins you. They'd sent Ambrose Burnside, or Ambrose Burnside was in eastern Tennessee. Lincoln said to John Hay, his loyal associate, that Rosecrans seemed confused and stunned, like a duck hit on the head. But so in October, and then the major change happens. Rosecrans is relieved of command, and he's replaced by Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant has been sent, originally they had taken off part of Grant's army and were sending it to Rosecrans, Sherman and a few of the other major figures in Grant's army. But after this sort of disaster at Chickamauga, which is an incredibly violent battle, an incredibly hot battle, one, as I was saying earlier, in which the casualty figures were only slightly inferior to the rate of casualties at Gettysburg, and in some cases more so. And which is undoubtedly a Confederate victory. That is to say, the Union armies are overwhelmed, they're shifted off the field, they have to sort of limp back into Chattanooga. But the Confederates lose more than 2,400 men killed. And that's a lot, because the Confederates do not have the supplies of men. They don't have the supplies of material either, but they really don't have the supplies of men that the Union has access to. The Union, Shelby Foote says in the Civil War documentary, and this is worth remembering, that the Union really fought the Civil War with one hand tied behind its back. During the Civil War, the Harvard-Yale boat race on the Charles happened every year. And not one of those guys ended up in the Army unless he wanted to be. Some of them did, but many of them didn't, and if they didn't, they weren't. So the Union didn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was reading this, the Union didn't really start conscription, like full conscription, until the beginning of 1863. So, the war's been going on for a while by the time they start, whereas, in the South, it's, all hands to the pumps, because there's many fewer. The North has many larger cities connected by rail. The Civil War makes Cleveland. Cleveland, I think, had maybe one iron foundry in it before the Civil War, and had dozens by the end. So, yay, Cleveland. The Union Army is clustered around Chattanooga into November. It's a cold winter. The Battle of Missionary Ridge, which is the last sort of major thing I'm going to talk about here, happens. The real meat of it happens, by the way, on my birthday, November 25th. I always think about that. But this is sort of looking northeast from Missionary Ridge. You can kind of see Atlanta off down that way. There's east, the Smoky Mountains, and you can sort of see the whole valley around Chattanooga. This is Chattanooga. I think there were about 3,700 people in Chattanooga at the time. So Bragg has been sort of chivied by the rest of the Confederate hierarchy to try and push the Unionists out of Chattanooga, because Chattanooga sits basically astride one of the most important railway lines in this part of the country. So they move up north. They take positions on Missionary Ridge. Also, by the way, at this point, Bragg wants to get rid of Longstreet. So he says to Longstreet, well, Burnside has occupied Knoxville. So I want you to go, take some men, go, Godspeed up toward Knoxville. And it's one of these funny sort of moments, because it's very clear that although he wanted to get Burnside out of Knoxville, he also wanted to get Longstreet out of southern Tennessee, because he had no illusions about what Longstreet was there to do. But so there are two basic phases of this. The first is the Battle of Lookout Mountain, where the Union attacks an entrenched position, a very high, Lookout Mountain. If I was a smart guy, I would have put a picture of Lookout Mountain in there, but of course I didn't. It's fought in late November. My birthday's right around Thanksgiving, and the same thing happens. I mean, I don't ask anyone if they're whatever, but oftentimes my birthday falls on Thanksgiving, and I always felt like that was kind of, I was kind of getting rooked, because people were already celebrating, so they weren't buying me more presents. But that's a whole other thing. 10-year-old John is still a little burned about that. Now the Unionists Grant could just stay in this heavily fortified area of Chattanooga, in this bend of the Tennessee River. But what he wants to do is move Bragg off of Missionary Ridge. Oop, that's Lookout Mountain. The morning of November 25th, Union armies are sort of getting ready to make their attack, and one of them is one of the divisions being led by Phil Sheridan, the cavalry commander. Sheridan is this very interesting guy. He's about this tall. He's a very tough, hard-nosed fighter, later a very merciless Indian fighter. sad to say. But also a guy with, and this is, the sort of chivalry of the Civil War. He rides out in front of the line looking up the Confederate batteries, pulls out a flask, toasts the Confederate gunners and says, "Here's at you, boys." And one of the Confederate guns opened up and splattered him with mud. And he said, "That was ungenerous. I'll take your guns for that." And the soldiers behind him thought he was ordering the charge, apparently. This is according to some. And they started charging up the hill, at which the rest of them were like, "Hey, wait. This was meant to be a sort of collective effort." But they end up executing this charge that really just knocks the Confederates off the top of Missionary Ridge. Grant shows up and he says, "Who ordered this charge?" And there's a number of stories about the response, but I think this is the one that really is most likely. He comes up to George Thomas and says, "Who ordered this charge?" Thomas, who was still unsure about what the outcome of it was going to be, turned to Grant and said, "I don't know, but I know I didn't." Eventually, so Bragg is the outcome of this fight on Missionary Ridge is that Bragg is once again forced out of Tennessee. The Union Army ends 1863 in control of Chattanooga. Chattanooga will be the jump-off point. Southern Tennessee is going to be the jump-off point for Sherman's march into Georgia, which now, as Todd was saying earlier, I went to library school in North Carolina, so I know what people have to say about General Sherman there, and his reputation in North Carolina is not as bad as it is some places further south. But really, those of you who have looked at the history of warfare a bit, look at the history of the English Civil War, like what an army in an enemy area tends to do compared to what Sherman did in Georgia and the Carolinas was pretty restrained, I think, by which nonetheless, I'm not surprised that the Confederates were upset about it, because this was a change in warfare as it had been fought since the 18th century. The professionalization of warfare had really changed European warfare, so that it wasn't so much about, back in the 17th century, in the 30 Years' War, central Germany was pretty much depopulated because the armies going through would take all the food and oftentimes kill all the people, depending on whether they were of a different religious group or sometimes just because. But the 18th century had really seen this change to a kind of professionalization of the military. So you didn't see this sort of depredations of armies marching against civilians in quite the same way that you had 100 or 200 years previously. Sherman's march really changed that, and I think that this is one reason why he's the partisans of the South, the partisans of the Lost Cause, are still kind of hacked off about the whole thing. So, but next time maybe a rebellion is not in your best interest. But we can just debate the larger question at some other point. But so just to sort of finish up, what we have at this point now, there's a sort of siege of Knoxville that goes on. Longstreet goes up to Knoxville, sort of knocks on the door, is sort of battered away by Burnside. But what we finally end up with is the Union firmly entrenched now in southern and eastern Tennessee. Lincoln has got what he wanted. The year 1863 has been this real sea change for the Union. It starts with the aftermath of Fredericksburg, a horrific Union defeat, a real disaster. In the middle, there's this sort of bright moment of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, at which point, so Henry Adams, in that letter I quoted the last time where he said, I want to fight some small man and lick him, he's in London, and another thing he says in that letter is, all thought of foreign involvement in the war is over now. The British had been sort of threatening to come in to render assistance to the southern side, partly because they sort of saw the Southerners as kind of simpatico, like we're aristocratic, they're aristocratic. One reason they didn't was because so many working class British people were dead set against the idea because they were opposed to, there was a lot of public opposition to slavery in Great Britain. They had gotten rid of it only about 50 years before, and then of course there was British colonialism, about which in this context the less said the better. But there is this sort of lower class sentiment which is making the British government wanting to be careful about it. The Confederate government had also offered Louis Napoleon, the sort of emperor of France, I think 1 million bales of cotton to come in on the Confederate side, and which Napoleon said, "I'd love to, but only if the British will do it too." So, but this once these battles happen in the middle of the war, once the invasion of Pennsylvania is thwarted, once the siege of Vicksburg is victoriously resolved, then there's no more. So Lincoln doesn't have to worry about that, and he's got a lot on his plate, right? Because he's got this war in 1864. He faces the prospect of getting reelected. And I mean, think about how fraught the electoral process is now. Think about what it would be like to try and run an election in the middle of a war when there's a fair number of people on your own side who don't think you're doing a very good job of it. As a matter of fact, there's a congressman from Ohio, Clement Van Landingham, who was eventually, he was what they liked to refer to in those days as a copperhead. Lincoln, who had also gotten rid of habeas corpus by this point, had Van Landingham thrown in jail and then had him exiled to the Confederacy. But Van Landingham was on the sort of more extreme end of what were called peace Democrats. There were peace Democrats in the North who thought that, like, okay, things have gone kind of ugly, but let's have a negotiated settlement, which Lincoln was dead set against. Lincoln is dead set against. So 1863, viewed overall, is this sea change in the fortunes of the war, from things going pretty bad to now once again Chickamauga, not what you'd call a Union victory, but Grant manages to pull the fat out of the fire with this victory at victories at Lookout Mountain and on Missionary Ridge. And so as the year 1864 comes around, the Union is in a much better position than it had been a year before, and the tenor of the war, the overall situation of the war, has changed in a way that's fundamental and will never, in the course of what remains of the war, shift back to Southern advantage in the way that it had been in 1862. I've talked us right out of time, so do come to Todd's talk tomorrow. It will be very interesting. And of course, if you have questions about this, I'm always up at the reference desk. If this place didn't close, I'd probably never leave. Thank you so much for coming out to our talks.